Here. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us here tonight. I would also like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we all gather today and pay my respect to their elders, past and present. So, I will be talking to you tonight about a client that I've been working with for some time. He is actually still a current client of mine. He has given me permission to present his case here tonight, but for the purpose of ensuring his anonymity, I have changed some background information to make sure that confidentiality remains. So for the purpose of tonight's presentation, I'm going to call my client Sam. Now, Sam is a male client from Middle East in his 50s. He actually comes from an ethnic minority in his country of birth. He's a secondary school graduate and a dedicated athlete and a trainer. Sam actually was an athlete for many years and was participating in competitions. And after he retired from that field, he became a trainer for others. He was well established in his country of birth. He had his own gym and was well respected in his own town and somewhat of a community leader back then. Sam actually fled his country of origin in 2016 due to persecution and harassment, which I'll talk about in a second. He arrived in Australia in late 2019 on a special humanitarian visa with his immediate family. And we began working with Sam in early 2020, just before COVID started. So it was beginning of February. That was good because it gave us a few sessions of face-to-face contact before we went into lockdown and we had to revert to telehealth. And it's been a little bit of a roller coaster since then, the past 18 months. But all in all, up until June this year, when I prepared this presentation, client attended 26 sessions to date. 11 of them were face-to-face and 15 were telehealth. This is a family unit or genogram of Sam. So as you can see, Sam's parents are deceased. They've actually passed away years ago due to natural causes, and Sam is one of 5 children. His brothers and sisters are actually resettled in other countries, some in US, some in Canada, and some throughout Europe. Sam came here with his wife and 4 children, and he describes his family as quite close, supportive, and well-connected family, that immediate family unit. He does have some extended family, aunties and uncles here in Australia, but he's not necessarily in regular contact with them. In terms of why Sam and his family decided to flee the country in 2016 was because, as I mentioned, they do come from an ethnic minority, and as such, they have experienced ongoing persecution and harassment for many years. And this was in various different forms, from simple as name calling to threats to being killed, lack of opportunities, but also experiencing quite a lot of violence in terms of bombings and shootings and things like that, in the context of what was going on at the time in the country. Sam himself actually witnessed many of his friends and neighbors being killed on the streets by the militia. And because he was in such a high respected role in his town and somewhat of a community leader, he was also involved a lot in providing support for those families whose members have been killed, including sometimes taking bodies and collecting body parts and bringing them to their families. For Sam, though, he identified 3 particular incidents as the most traumatic, and one in particular. So there were 3 attempted kidnappings in a period of 6 months prior to them fleeing their country. And the particular one that he spoke about quite extensively was the physical beating that he sustained during one night when a group of militia came into his gym. They actually had him at gunpoint, threatened to kill him, severely beat him, and then they completely destroyed his gym, which was very difficult for him because that was his livelihood, and that was something that he invested his life in. This prompted Sam and his family to actually flee the country, as I mentioned, in 2016, and they went to a first country of asylum where they spent approximately 3 years. Now, Sam describes that experience as quite difficult because they had no financial or practical support. They didn't know anyone there. They weren't allowed to work. And for Sam in particular, it was difficult because they weren't, as he said, from everything to nothing. And that adjustment was impacting him quite greatly, in addition to some of the psychological difficulties that he began experiencing. Once they came to Australia, things were a little bit better on that front, but Sam still struggled with language barrier and lack of understanding of Australian culture and systems and how things were operating in this country, because it was very different to where he came from. What was also happening, and this is something that Sam actually spoke about quite a lot, was this notion of almost a role reversal, where his children were actually picking up a language much quicker, understanding how things were being run here and what needed to be done, much better than what him and his wife were able to do. And therefore they were taking on some of the things and some of the roles that in Sam's mind was his role to take as a man of the household. Because of some of the difficulties, psychological difficulties that Sam was experiencing, he also was socially withdrawing as well. And unfortunately, the timing of their arrival to the country and the onset of COVID-19 also meant that the family, and him included, were restricted in terms of the services that were able to access that were otherwise available to newly arrived refugees, and quite important in their recovery and resettlement. In addition to having to deal with the ongoing stress of COVID, Sam's difficulties also presented in a sense that he still had quite a lot of extended family still overseas in his original country of origin, and the response to COVID was very different. And Sam was quite worried about his family, but also there was a bit of a guilt associated around it, because he was here where things were being dealt differently as opposed to his family that were there. He actually lost two cousins and a very close friend of his due to COVID last year. So when we talk about Sam, in terms of who he is and what are some of the difficulties that he's gone through, we'd like to talk about complex interaction of challenges as formulated by Roach and Coelho. So not only did Sam have to face the traumatic experiences and the impact that those experiences have had on him, he also had to go through quite a lot of difficulties in terms of resettlement and having to adjust to new culture and new way of life, all in the context of also dealing with everyday normal life challenges that we all have to face with those additional difficulties. The recovery environment was quite important for Sam, because unfortunately the pandemic did not help in that sense. But the good thing about Sam is that he had quite a lot of internal and external protective factors that were helping and aiding in his recovery, including his family, his willingness to get better, but also the access to the services such as ours. In terms of presentation and assessment, Sam presented as very neat, very gentleman-like. There were no particular perceptual disturbances observed, no suicidal ideation of reports of thoughts of harm or anything like that. If I were to use a metaphor in terms of who was in front of me, it was almost like a ball of anxiety. Sam was sitting on the edge of the seat. He was avoiding eye contact, and there was a very tense body posture throughout the sessions. I did address the avoiding eye contact because I wanted to make sure whether that was because of his clinical presentation or whether it was a cultural thing. And Sam did explain that because he was in a room with two females, myself and a female interpreter, he didn't feel that it was culturally appropriate to maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds. Overall, his affect was very constricted, and he did report experiencing quite a lot of anxiety, but he overall had a really good insight, and we did have a really good engagement from the beginning. So he was able to share with me things that were very personal to him that he said that he wasn't talking to anyone about. And I guess, we were lucky enough to be able to have those face-to-face sessions to begin with in this pandemic, because it really helped forge that therapeutic relationship between Sam and myself. In terms of the symptoms, clinical symptoms, I'm not going to go through all of them, but if I was to pick up a DSM-5 or ICD-10, he would pretty much tick every single box for PTSD in terms of experiencing intrusive memories, flashbacks, and nightmares. They were quite frequent, daily, several times a day. Quite a lot of avoidance, which was actually accounting for that social withdrawal to begin with. Sam is living in a suburb that is populated by a lot of people from his country of origin, and that unfortunately has been a trigger for Sam. So hearing his language, seeing people from his country was a trigger, and that's something that he was pretty much avoiding. Authority figures, police, was another big trigger for him, and unfortunately during the COVID and the first lockdown, there was a lot of police out on the street. But one thing that really struck the chord with me in terms of Sam's presentation was this very strong held beliefs and expectations that he had about himself and about the world. Sam explained to me that he was an athlete, he was strong, he was able to do and deal with so much, and now he's none of that. And he said, I will never be the same again. I'm broken. I am not the man that I was. I can't care for my family. And there was a lot of guilt and shame associated with some of those thoughts. Although Sam wasn't able to label them as such, for him it was very much focused on what was happening with him immediately in terms of his body, and I'll talk about that in a second. But another pronounced sort of belief, very strong held belief that Sam had, was that the world is not safe and that people can't be trusted. And that's something that, we had to be very mindful of as we were working with Sam from day one. As I mentioned, quite a lot of other PTSD symptoms, including sleep disturbances and a lot of hypervigilance. So one of the reasons why Sam would stay home is because he was not too certain that someone's not going to come and break him while he's away, in addition to being triggered when he's out. He would check doors and windows and only going in the middle of the day, only if necessary. In addition to, your standard sort of PTSD symptoms that Sam presented with, he also presented with symptoms of panic attacks, and he actually reported experiencing panic attacks quite frequently. Listed here are pretty much all the physiological sensations that Sam reported experiencing, and the one very pronounced thing for him was this constant fear that he was going to die while he's experiencing a panic attack. This has led obviously to quite a persistent worry that he was going to experience panic attack wherever else he goes, if he goes outside. And he's developed a little routine almost around managing some of that anxiety and some of that arousal. So in addition to avoidance, there were frequent doctor visits to make sure and to check that everything's okay with his body. He used to carry a bottle of water at all times. And the one that was quite important in terms of when we were doing setting up a treatment goals for him was the reliance on Valium. So after the incident in 2016 and after the onset of his symptoms thereafter, Sam was prescribed Valium by a doctor, and this is something that he continued to use on a daily basis. So when I first started working with him, he was taking Valium daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day, just to manage those symptoms. So when we talk about, I guess, if we were to formulate the case of Sam, really the way I saw it is that there were almost two parallel processes happening in a way. One was that there would be a trigger for his intrusive symptoms associated with the traumatic experiences that he's been through, which then led to an increased arousal and that flight or fight response being triggered, and therefore leading to ultimate panic attacks. But in addition to that, what Sam was reporting, that there were moments and there were times where he was experiencing panic attacks, not necessarily because they were being triggered by the trauma symptoms, but rather by physiological symptoms. And the way Sam explained that to me was that because he was an athlete, he was very attuned to his body and any changes, physiological changes that were happening in his body. So some of those changes in those physiological symptoms would actually also lead to that increased arousal, this idea that something's wrong with him, he might die, and then lead to a panic attack. For example, he would be sitting and having dinner, everything, things would be okay. And then 15, 20 minutes later, he would have a bit of an indigestion, a bit of a funny feeling in his stomach, and that would actually trigger the arousal. So from there, after completing my assessment sessions with Sam, it became quite apparent that we had several therapeutic goals that we needed to sort of address. And this was done in collaboration with Sam. The number one, the very first one and most important one was really ensuring that we established that safety for Sam in a session with me, but also generalized elsewhere. And we did that through, like I mentioned, forging that therapeutic alliance and therapeutic relationship between Sam and myself, but also making sure that we have some sense of predictability for him. And this is something they identified as quite important. So in terms of using the interpreters, I would always try to use the same interpreter that was familiar with his story already. In terms of when he was coming to the office, we would try and use the same room. He would sit in the same chair, which, mind you, was always next to the door. And things like that. So in addition to that, we also I also moved that same space. So it was very important that I stay with him and that I allow him to engage in some of the things that we were trying to do if he was ready to do so. And I gotta say that's something that we're still continuously working on, establishing that safety. Obviously, the primarily focus was to working on reducing that arousal and addressing those panic symptoms while also completing, working his trauma symptoms, but also addressing that grief and loss that he reported experiencing, in a sense that, Sam really felt like he was not a man that he was, and there was a deep sense of loss around that. So we really had to work out, cut up ourselves, but we had to rebuild that self-worth and that sense of self that he lost. All while managing some of the maintaining factors that we spoke about, like Valium and avoidance and all that, in the context of ever-changing COVID-19 pandemic, which unfortunately contributed in some ways to that sense of uncertainty. Now, in terms of therapeutic approaches, I've listed them here just as a summary. I would like to emphasize that by no means was this a linear approach. This is something that I would, use in combination and keep changing from one to another. Also in the context of obviously going from face-to-face to telehealth, back to face-to-face and so forth. But the very first thing that we did, and I think was quite actually important, was to actually liaise with other health professionals to ensure that there's some sort of management of his reliance on Valium and getting him onto a more appropriate medication. So the psychiatrist that was working with Sam was quite good, and the GP. And we've managed to actually get Sam, actually the psychiatrist did it, on mirtazapine, 25 milligrams daily. But also excluding any physical causes for his symptoms. So he's seen quite a lot of specialists to rule out any cardiovascular difficulties or anything like that. And the outcome of that was that it was purely psychological, what he was experiencing. A lot of effort went into psychoeducation, and this was quite important because what we needed to do is really normalize his symptoms, but also link them to the experiences that he went through. This was particularly important because Sam reported that his very first panic attack that he experienced was several minutes after the militia group that came to his gym and severely beat him left. And this was, at that point, was when he experienced the first panic attack. A lot of psychoeducation around medication, the different types of medication and what each one was doing, but also psychoeducation around the triggers and some of the maintaining behaviors or maintaining symptoms. We did a lot of grounding strategies in terms of breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, and body activation. Now, this was very important because what Sam told me was that when he experienced those panic attacks, that elevated anxiety levels, he felt like he needed to get his body moving. So it was really activating that physiological anxiety that he was feeling. And that was great, except that Sam also was afraid that if he goes for a bit of a walk or tries to walk it off, he was afraid that would increase his heart rate, which would then again even further activate his arousal and make him more anxious. So we did a little bit of work around that, and we did it in a session. I got him to pace around to see how his body's responding to that. Now, another thing that we did, which was really, really helpful for Sam, was implementing heart rate variability training. Now, for those of you who don't know what that is, I'll simplify it, but essentially it's a little monitor that a little cuff that you put on your finger that measures heart rate and breathing rate, and it gives a direct input on the computer on the screen in terms of a person's arousal. And this was really good because it was actually giving a direct feedback to Sam how his body was responding to some of the things that were being discussed in the session. But it was also a really good way of teaching Sam how to use those grounding strategies to try and reduce his arousal. We then got him to face some of the triggers that he was so afraid of that was triggering some of the intrusive symptoms and panic attacks. And while obviously using the grounding strategies, and a very important component, I guess, was to really challenge some of those negative beliefs and changes in perception that Sam seemed to hold on to. Particularly, my anxiety will never go away and I will die when I have a panic attack. I can't control it. I will be broken forever. I'm not the man I was. I'm not safe. So throughout some of these exposures, throughout the grounding, using HRV, and also through recounting and confronting that trauma narrative around the events that he experienced, we've managed to try and challenge some of his beliefs. Now, the recounting and confronting of trauma narrative was very important because what we wanted to do is really help Sam find the meaning behind what he's experienced, but also explore the concept of responsibility that he was unfortunately assigning to himself. So what we really wanted to do is shift this concept of the blame that he held on to that was triggering that guilt and that shame. And that was apparent because Sam would talk, when we were talking about his trauma, he would say things like, what if I just done this, then this wouldn't happen. If I've done this, then my family wouldn't experience that. So he was holding on a lot of responsibility for that. And what we needed to do is really shift it towards, perpetrator of some of those events. But also exploring through that recounting and confronting trauma narrative, how that experience has actually made him stronger and made him a survivor, so not just a victim. And we did that by exploring some of his strengths and not just the current strengths, but also the past strengths. What Sam identified was things that how he was before and how he's not now, and really explored that discrepancy between the two. Again, with the aim of challenging that that's actually not necessarily the case, that the experiences that he's been through has actually changed him, yes, but perhaps for better, in a sense that he is now stronger and more able to cope with difficulties. And we've used counseling as an example, in a sense that, well, you're coming here, you're talking about things, you're trying things that you wouldn't try otherwise, or you haven't done for 3 years. That requires courage, that requires strength, and really tying it back into some of the experiences that he's been through and what helped him get through it back then. But also, I guess what we were doing is really exploring that value system that Sam held and how he viewed himself and the world around him, but also how others viewed him. Because again, there was a discrepancy between the two, and we've done some interesting tasks in setting up a little homework for him and the family and see whether the two things match. So these are the psychometric outcomes that we've sort of followed up on in terms of the measurements that we've taken throughout the course of my involvement with Sam. Now, we've measured obviously for anxiety, depression, and trauma symptoms. And we've used Hopkins Symptoms Checklist to measure anxiety and depression symptoms, and Harvard Trauma Questionnaire to measure trauma symptoms. Both psychometric tools have been tested with refugee population, different refugee populations, and have proven to have a really good reliability and validity. And maximum score for both measures is out of 4. As you can see at the beginning, when we first started, which was in February 2020, Sam was pretty high on all 3 measures. And this is where we were in June 2021, so not that long ago. Now, what I would like to just discuss with you briefly is this little dip in terms of what was happening here. As you can see, this was in May last year. So this was around the time when we were in a lockdown. And what was actually happening at the time is that Sam has actually gone off his antidepressant back to Valium. So he was using Valium again daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. And he was at home. So he wasn't actually being necessarily exposed to any of the triggers that were bringing on some of the symptoms. So in some way, things were good. However, when things kind of resumed back to normal and we got him off Valium again and back on antidepressants, his scores went up. In terms of outcomes, Sam has reported reduction in the frequency, intensity, and duration of his symptoms. So he's basically said to me that, he's not necessarily experiencing intrusions several times a day, once a day only. And when they do come about, he's able to better manage that emotional distress that comes with it. In terms of the panic attacks, he's reporting having or experiencing panic attacks once every fortnight. And that's usually when there's some big trigger associated, like, for example, when he had a car accident, that was quite anxiety provoking and he experienced a panic attack at that point. He stopped relying on a lot of safety behaviors, including avoidance, taking Valium, and doctor visits. So that's gone down. And he's actually started engaging with his community and creating some social contacts. And to see how he's gone from not being able to, necessarily go out and wanting to engage to being able to finish English course. And at the moment, he's doing volunteering as a part of the practical component for another course that he's doing, was amazing to see. But perhaps the most important thing that I've observed in terms of Sam's journey was this shift that happened in terms of how he viewed himself, that sense of self-worth and identity. So it went from being, I will never be the same, I'm going to be broken forever, to maybe I'll be myself again and I need to persist and I think I will be better. And Sam jokingly said to me, not that long ago, I think I'm getting better. I'm only using Valium once a fortnight. That's good. I said, yes, that's great. But I guess, we still have some work to do with Sam, hence why he's still a current client of mine. But I guess just to bring this to a close, this quote really resonates with me in a sense that, I saw a survivor in Sam, I saw a fighter in Sam, but really what needed to happen in our sessions is to get him to see that for himself, to get him to see himself as a fighter and as a survivor, and being able to then use some of those experiences that he's been through and the difficulties that he's been through and make that better and stronger for himself. And I think I'm going to stop there because time-wise, we might leave some time for questions, if that's okay.